The floodwater had finally receded, leaving behind 3 inches of black sludge across my basement floor and the sharp smell of mold that would take months to forget. But it was the crack in the foundation that caught my eye that morning, a jagged split running floor to ceiling along the east wall, wide enough to slip 2 fingers through. Behind it, I could hear something that made my pulse skip. Empty space, and the faint whisper of moving air where solid earth should have been. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The spring floods of 2023 had been the worst in Pennsylvania history. 3 weeks of rain had swollen the Allegheny tributaries until they burst their banks, turning farmland into temporary lakes and basements into swimming pools. Mine had gotten the worst of it, sitting as it did at the lowest point of our property, built in 1928 by hands that were now dust. My husband Robert had always meant to install a better drainage system, had marked it on his endless list of farm repairs that never seemed to shrink. Then the cancer took him in November, and suddenly I was alone with 80 acres, a failing dairy operation, and a basement full of his father's carefully organized records slowly dissolving in contaminated groundwater. I was 41 years old, a widow for 6 months, and standing in rubber boots in the wreckage of my home, trying to decide if I had the strength to keep fighting. The insurance adjuster had been blunt. Foundation damage wasn't covered under my policy. The estimate to repair the basement and remove the mold was somewhere north of $30,000. Money I didn't have. Money the farm couldn't generate, not with milk prices where they were, and half my herd sold off to pay Robert's medical bills. My daughter Emma had been pushing me to sell for months now. She was 19, studying engineering at Penn State, building a life that had nothing to do with dairy cows and pre-dawn milking schedules. She loved me, I knew that, but she also saw the farm as an anchor dragging me under, and maybe she wasn't wrong. The realtor had already called twice this month, circling like a patient vulture, mentioning interested developers who saw potential in land this close to expanding suburbs. But standing there in the ruined basement, staring at that crack in the wall, I felt something shift. Not hope exactly, more like stubborn curiosity. The same instinct that had kept my grandmother on this land through the Depression, that had kept my mother here when my father died young. We were Mitchell women, and we didn't surrender without understanding what we were surrendering to. I grabbed a flashlight from the utility shelf and aimed it through the crack. The beam disappeared into darkness, illuminating nothing but empty air. I pressed my face against the cold stone, trying to see more. Space beyond was definitely hollow, a void that shouldn't exist beneath a Pennsylvania farmhouse built on bedrock. I could feel cool air flowing through the gap, carrying with it a smell that wasn't mold or flood damage. It was older, drier, like the inside of a long-sealed room. My hands were shaking as I found Robert's crowbar in the tool chest. The foundation was already compromised. A little more damage wouldn't matter now. I wedged the crowbar into the crack and pulled. The limestone gave way easier than I expected. Century-old mortar crumbling like stale bread. Chunks of stone fell away, widening the opening until it was large enough to crouch through. Beyond the wall was a tunnel. Not a natural cave formation, but something deliberately constructed, with arched brick walls and a floor of fitted stone that disappeared into absolute darkness. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each brick precisely placed, the ceiling high enough that I could stand upright. Someone had built this with care and intention, probably at the same time as the house itself, maybe before, and they'd gone to great lengths to hide it. I stepped through the gap, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead. The tunnel ran straight for about 15 feet before angling sharply to the right. The air was remarkably dry despite the recent flooding, suggesting this passage had been engineered to stay above the water table. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. The walls showed no signs of recent disturbance. Dust lay thick and undisturbed on the floor, my boots leaving the first footprints in what might have been decades. Spiderwebs stretched across corners, their inhabitants long dead and desiccated. But there was something else too. Marks scratched into the brick at regular intervals, symbols I didn't recognize, possibly some kind of directional guide for people navigating in darkness. I followed the tunnel around the corner and found it continued for another 30 feet before ending at a heavy wooden door, its surface covered in peeling green paint. The hinges were massive iron affairs, rusted but still intact. There was no lock I could see, just a simple latch mechanism. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. Nothing but silence on the other side. When I lifted the latch and pulled, the door resisted for a moment, then swung open with a groan that echoed back down the tunnel behind me. My flashlight beam swept across the space beyond, and what I saw made me forget to breathe. It was a room, maybe 20 feet square, with the same careful brickwork as the tunnel. But this space had been furnished. Against one wall stood wooden shelving units filled with glass bottles, hundreds of them, dusty but intact. Against another wall were wooden barrels stacked 3 high, and in the center of the room, positioned like a throne, was a massive iron safe, taller than me, its door marked with an ornate letter B worked into the metal. I stepped inside, boots crunching on broken glass. Someone had been here before me, though probably not recently. Several bottles lay smashed on the floor, their contents long evaporated, leaving only crystalline residue. I picked up one of the intact bottles and wiped away the dust. The label was faded but legible. Old Overholt Rye Whiskey, bottled 1926, Prohibition. This was a bootlegger's cache, hidden beneath my house for nearly a century. The tunnel must have provided secret access, probably running all the way to the barn or one of the outbuildings where deliveries could be received without attracting attention. My property sat just 40 miles from the Canadian border, close enough to make smuggling practical. I'd grown up hearing vague stories about the area's rum-running history, but I'd never imagined my own home was part of it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I approached the safe carefully, running my hands over its cold surface. It was a monster of engineering, probably weighed close to 1,000 pounds. The door was secured with a combination lock, its brass dial still smooth despite the decades. Someone had gone to enormous expense to install this thing down here, which meant whatever they'd stored inside was valuable enough to justify it. On impulse, I tried the handle. It didn't budge. Of course it wouldn't. This safe had been locked for 80 years or more, its combination probably lost when whoever hid it here died or fled or got arrested. I was looking at an impenetrable mystery, tantalizing but inaccessible. But as I swept my flashlight around the room more carefully, I noticed something I'd missed before. Scratched into the brick wall beside the safe, barely visible under decades of dust, were numbers. 11-7-33. A date? November 7, 1933. I knew that date. Everyone who studied Prohibition history knew it. That was the day Pennsylvania voted to ratify the 21st Amendment, effectively ending Prohibition in the state. Could it be that simple? I knelt beside the safe and spun the dial carefully. 11 to the right, 7 to the left, 33 to the right. I heard nothing, no telltale clicking. I tried again, slower this time, really listening. Still nothing. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe those numbers meant something else entirely. But I'd come this far. I tried one more variation. Right to 11, left past 11 to 7, right past 7 to 33. This time, I felt something shift deep in the mechanism. I held my breath and pulled the handle. The door swung open. Inside the safe was a sight that made me sink to my knees on the cold stone floor. Stacks of cash, bundled and wrapped in oilcloth, filled most of the interior. But not modern currency. These were bills from the 1920s and early 1930s, their paper yellowed but intact. Gold certificates, silver certificates, even some national banknotes I'd only seen in museums. And beneath the money, filling the bottom third of the safe, were leather ledgers. their pages covered in meticulous handwriting. I pulled out one of the ledgers with trembling hands and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with entries, dates, names, quantities, amounts. It was an accounting book, recording transactions that someone had been careful to document despite their illegal nature. As I scanned the entries, certain names jumped out at me: Brennan, O'Malley, DeStefano, families I recognized from the area, some of whose descendants still lived in town. And there, near the back of the ledger, I found the entry that explained everything. Property purchase, Mitchell Farm, $12,000 cash, November 1928, paid to J. Mitchell. My husband's grandfather. The same year the house was built, the same year the tunnel and vault must have been constructed. The farm hadn't been bought with honest dairy money. It had been purchased with bootlegging profits, built on a foundation of illegal whiskey and smuggled Canadian liquor. My home, my life, everything I'd thought I knew about my family's history was rooted in secrets and criminal enterprise. I sat on the floor of that hidden room, surrounded by evidence of crimes committed a century ago, and started laughing. It wasn't happy laughter. It was the slightly unhinged sound of someone whose world had just been turned inside out. Here I was, about to lose the farm to debt and circumstance, and I'd just discovered that the farm itself had been paid for with dirty money. The irony was almost too perfect. My grandmother had always told stories about the Depression years, how the farm had survived when others failed, how they'd always managed to have just enough to keep going. Now I knew why. They hadn't been better farmers, they'd been better criminals. I pulled myself together and started taking inventory. The cash alone was substantial, even accounting for the difference in modern value. But this wasn't money I could just deposit in a bank without raising serious questions. And the whiskey, if it was still good after all these years, might be worth a fortune to collectors. Some of these bottles were from distilleries that no longer existed, from vintages that shouldn't exist at all because they were made during Prohibition. But none of that solved my immediate problem. The basement was still flooded, the foundation still cracked, and I still didn't have $30,000. What I had was a vault full of century-old evidence that my family had once been involved in organized crime. I was still trying to process this when I heard footsteps above me, in the basement. Someone was walking across the flooded floor, their boots splashing through the standing water. I froze, my heart hammering. Nobody should be in my house. Nobody knew I'd discovered this tunnel. "Mrs. Mitchell?" a man's voice called out. "Sarah? Are you down here?" I recognized the voice. Deputy Martin Burke, one of the county sheriffs. I'd known him since high school. His father had been Robert's best friend. He usually stopped by once a week to check on me, a courtesy call disguised as official business. But right now, standing in a hidden bootlegger's vault with a fortune in illegal whiskey and unexplained cash, the last person I wanted to see was a law enforcement officer. "Sarah?" His voice was closer now. He'd found the opening in the wall. His flashlight beam probed down the tunnel toward the room where I stood frozen in indecision. I had maybe 30 seconds to decide. Close the safe and pretend I'd just discovered an empty tunnel, or trust Martin with the truth and hope his loyalty to Robert's memory outweighed his duty to report this. The beam of his flashlight hit me, and I saw his silhouette fill the doorway of the vault. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the scene. Me on my knees, the open safe, the shelves of whiskey bottles, the scattered evidence of a century-old crime. "Jesus Christ, Sarah," he whispered. "What the hell have you found?" Martin Burke stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes that hung in the stale air. I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and something harder to read. Finally, he stepped into the vault, pulled the door shut behind him, and leaned against it like he was trying to keep the rest of the world out. "How long have you known about this?" His voice was quiet, almost conversational, which somehow made the question more dangerous. "About 20 minutes. I gestured at the open safe, the scattered ledgers. I was cleaning up from the flood, found the crack in the foundation. The tunnel was behind it." He moved closer, examining the shelves of whiskey bottles without touching them. His grandfather had been a sheriff during Prohibition. Martin had grown up on stories about the runners and the raids, the violence that had erupted when money and morality collided in these rural valleys. He knew this history better than most. "This is Brennan's operation." It wasn't a question. He picked up one of the ledgers and flipped through it carefully. Patrick Brennan. He ran half the liquor between Buffalo and Pittsburgh from 1925 to 1933. My grandfather spent years trying to catch him, never could make anything stick. He looked up at me. "Your husband's family never mentioned this?" Robert didn't know. His grandfather died when he was young. His father never talked about how they got the money to buy this place. I pulled myself to my feet, my knees aching from kneeling on cold stone. I thought they were just lucky, that they'd saved well or gotten a good deal. I never questioned it. Martin set the ledger down and turned his attention to the safe's contents. He didn't touch the money, but I could see him calculating, his cop brain doing the math. "This is a lot of cash, Sarah. Even accounting for inflation, even if half of it's too old to be legal tender anymore, you're looking at serious money." "I know. And the whiskey, some of these bottles, if they're authentic, if they've been stored properly." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Collectors would pay a fortune. We're not talking thousands, we're talking millions, potentially." The number hung between us, impossibly large. Millions. Enough to save the farm 10 times over. Enough to pay off every debt, repair every building, buy new equipment, rebuild the herd. Enough to give Emma the education she wanted without student loans. Enough to secure a future I'd stopped believing in. "But it's evidence," I said flatly. "Evidence of crimes committed by people who are probably all dead now." "Evidence of crimes committed by your family," Martin corrected gently. "Against your family. The ledgers show your husband's grandfather was paid $12,000 in 1928. That's probably worth close to $200,000 in modern money, but it was bootlegging money. Illegal then, illegal now in terms of how it was obtained." I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sudden. "So what are you saying, Martin? That I should just leave it here? Pretend I never found it? Let the bank take the farm while a fortune sits buried in my basement?" "I'm saying this is complicated." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "If you try to sell any of this, people will ask questions. The whiskey especially. You can't just walk into an auction house with 100 cases of Prohibition-era liquor and not expect serious scrutiny." "Then what do I do?" He was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable in the flashlight glow. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I didn't see this. I came by to check on the flood damage. You weren't home. I left. That's my official position." I stared at him. "You're a cop, Martin." "I'm a friend first. And Robert saved my dad's life once. Did you know that? Heart attack in the dairy barn. Robert did CPR until the ambulance came. My family owes yours." He met my eyes steadily. "I can give you time to figure this out, Sarah, but you need to be smart about it. Whatever you decide to do, it has to be quiet and it has to be legal, or legal enough that nobody looks too close." After Martin left, promising to come back tomorrow to help me seal the foundation crack before anyone else discovered it, I sat alone in the vault for another hour. The weight of the decision ahead pressed down on me like the earth above. This money, this whiskey, it was tainted, built on breaking laws that were themselves unjust, but laws nonetheless. My grandmother had benefited from it, my husband's father had grown up on it, and I was now heir to it all. I thought about Robert, about the man I'd married 22 years ago. He'd been honest to a fault, the kind of person who drove back to the store if the cashier gave him too much change. What would he think about his grandfather's secret fortune? Would he want me to report it, to clear the family name even, if it meant losing everything? Or would he want me to be practical, to do whatever it took to save the farm he'd loved? I gathered up several of the ledgers and a few sample bottles, wrapping them carefully in an old tarp I found in the corner. Then I closed the safe, spun the lock, and made my way back through the tunnel. In the basement, I used scrap lumber and a tarp to cover the hole in the wall, making it look like temporary flood repairs rather than anything suspicious. That night, I spread the ledgers across my kitchen table and started reading in earnest. The meticulous handwriting told a story of methodical criminal enterprise. Patrick Brennan hadn't been some romantic outlaw. He'd been a businessman who happened to deal in illegal goods, tracking every transaction with the precision of an accountant. The names in these pages were a who's who of the region's founding families. Judges, businessmen, even a Presbyterian minister who apparently had a standing weekly order. But it was the annotations in the margins that caught my attention. Next to certain entries were symbols: stars, circles, crosses. I couldn't figure out what they meant until I noticed a pattern. The entries marked with stars were all from November 1933, right around the time Prohibition ended, and they were all marked collected in full or paid out. Brennan had been settling accounts, preparing to go legitimate or disappear. Except he hadn't done either. According to local history, Patrick Brennan had vanished in December 1933. Just disappeared one night, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. The official story was that he'd fled, probably to Canada, possibly owing money to the wrong people. His family had struggled for years after his disappearance, eventually losing their home and scattering to different states. But what if he hadn't fled? What if something else had happened? I pulled out my laptop and started searching through digitized newspaper archives. It took 3 hours, but I finally found it. A brief mention in the March 1934 edition of the county paper. Remains found near Kinzua Creek, identified as missing businessman Patrick Brennan. Sheriff's Department investigating circumstances of death. There was no follow-up article, nothing about arrests or suspects or conclusions. The story had simply died, buried like so much else in those desperate years. I leaned back in my chair, watching dawn light creep through the kitchen window. Patrick Brennan was dead, murdered probably, before he could retrieve his fortune or settle his final accounts. The safe had been sitting in my basement for 90 years, its contents forgotten by everyone, except possibly whoever had killed its owner. The phone rang, making me jump. It was Emma, calling from her dorm room. "Mom, I just heard about the flooding. Are you okay? Do you need me to come home?" I almost laughed. My daughter, studying engineering, practical and forward-thinking, calling to check on her mother who was sitting at a table, surrounded by evidence of century-old crimes. "I'm fine, honey. The water's mostly gone. Just clean up now." The realtor called me. Emma's voice was hesitant. "Mr. Peterson, he said he'd made you an offer last month and you hadn't responded. He wanted to know if I could convince you to consider it." My hand tightened on the phone. "He called you directly?" "He said the development company is willing to go higher, $700,000 for the property." "Mom, that's a lot of money. Enough to pay off everything and have plenty left over. You could move somewhere smaller, somewhere without all the maintenance and stress." "This is my home, Emma. It's a farm that's killing you." Her voice cracked slightly. "I watched it drain Dad, watched him work himself to death trying to keep it going. Now it's draining you. When does it stop? Your father died of cancer, not overwork." The stress didn't help. The financial pressure, the constant worry about yields and prices and weather. That kind of stress kills people slowly. She was crying now, trying to hide it but failing. "I don't want to lose you too, Mom. Not to this place." I looked around the kitchen, at the worn counters Robert had installed himself, at the window overlooking fields his grandfather had cleared, at the doorway where 4 generations of children had measured their growth with pencil marks on the frame. "I'll think about the offer," I heard myself say, "but I'm not making any promises." After we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at nothing. Emma was right, in a way. The farm had taken so much from us, but it had given too, in ways she couldn't see yet. Legacy wasn't just about profit and loss. It was about continuity, about knowing where you came from and why it mattered. The question was whether Brennan's hidden fortune changed that calculus, whether tainted money could buy clean futures. Martin came back that afternoon with concrete mix and rebar, supposedly to help me repair the foundation properly. We worked in silence for a while, sealing the entrance to the tunnel with fresh concrete that would look like legitimate repair work. When we finished, he sat on the basement stairs wiping concrete dust from his hands. "I did some research last night," he said quietly. "Patrick Brennan. His murder was never solved. My grandfather's files mention probable organized crime involvement, but no specific suspects. I found the newspaper article, March 1934. Martin nodded. "There's more. Brennan had partners, people higher up the supply chain. One of them was named Vincent Di Stefano. Italian family out of Buffalo, connected to the mob. After Brennan disappeared, Di Stefano's organization took over most of the regional distribution. And Vincent Di Stefano's grandson, Marcus Di Stefano, currently runs the largest development company in western Pennsylvania, the same company that's been trying to buy your property." The words hung in the dusty air between us. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "You think they know about the vault?" "I think it's an interesting coincidence that they're pushing so hard to acquire this particular piece of land. There are a dozen other farms they could develop, bigger properties, better locations, but they keep coming back to yours." Martin stood up, brushing off his jeans. "Could be they're just persistent. Or could be someone in that family knows there's unfinished business here." "Unfinished business from 90 years ago?" "Money doesn't have an expiration date, Sarah, and families remember, especially families like the Di Stefanos." He headed toward the stairs, then paused. "Be careful who you talk to about this, and for God's sake, don't try to sell anything until we know more." After Martin left, I went back upstairs and called a number I'd found in one of Robert's old business card collections. Professor James Chen, University of Pittsburgh, Department of History. He'd come to the farm 5 years ago researching Prohibition-era smuggling routes, had spent a long afternoon talking with Robert about local legends and rumors. He'd left his card, saying to call if we ever found anything interesting. Well, this definitely qualified. "Professor Chen? This is Sarah Mitchell. You visited my farm a few years back, talked to my late husband about Prohibition history." "Mrs. Mitchell, yes, I remember. I'm so sorry about your husband. He was very helpful to my research." His voice was warm, curious. "What can I do for you?" "I may have found something related to your research. I was hoping you might be willing to take a look, off the record." There was a pause. "Off the record?" "I need to understand what I have before I make any official reports. I need someone who knows this history and can be discreet." Another pause, longer this time. "I can be there tomorrow afternoon. But Mrs. Mitchell, if you found something significant, there are protocols for this kind of discovery." "I understand. I just need guidance first. Professional guidance from someone who isn't going to immediately call the authorities or the media." He agreed to come, and I spent the rest of the evening carefully documenting everything in the vault with my phone camera. I photographed the bottles, the ledgers, the safe, the tunnel itself. If something happened, if someone tried to take this from me or claim it was theirs, I wanted evidence of my discovery. That night, I dreamed about Patrick Brennan. In the dream, he was standing in the vault, carefully stacking bills in the safe, while a younger version of my husband's grandfather watched from the doorway. "It's insurance," Dream Brennan was saying. "Something to fall back on when the whole thing comes crashing down. Nobody knows about this but us." Then the scene shifted. Brennan was lying in the tunnel, blood pooling beneath him, while someone in shadow rifled through his pockets. "Where is it?" the shadow person demanded. "Where's the combination?" I woke with my heart racing, the dawn light already filling my bedroom. It was just a dream, but it felt like memory, like the house itself was trying to tell me something about what had happened in those hidden spaces beneath my floor. Professor Chen arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, driving a modest sedan and carrying a worn leather briefcase. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and the careful movements of someone who spent his life handling fragile historical materials. I led him down to the basement, to the concealed entrance Martin and I had prepared, and watched his face as I showed him what lay beyond. To his credit, He didn't exclaim or rush forward. He simply stood very still, taking it all in with a historian's methodical gaze. "Mrs. Mitchell," he finally said, "do you understand what you have here?" A bootlegger's vault, probably Patrick Brennan's final cache. This is one of the most significant Prohibition discoveries in decades. The ledgers alone are historically invaluable. They could reshape our understanding of how organized crime functioned in rural areas during this period. He moved closer to the shelves, examining bottles without touching them. And if the whiskey is authentic and properly stored, which it appears to be, you're looking at a collection worth millions, possibly tens of millions. The number was so large it became almost meaningless. How would someone even sell something like this? Very carefully, through specialized auction houses that deal in historical spirits. There are collectors worldwide who pay extraordinary prices for authenticated Prohibition-era bottles. But the provenance would need to be established, the legal ownership clarified. He turned to face me. "This is going to be complicated, Mrs. Mitchell, very complicated." "I'm beginning to understand that." He spent the next 3 hours examining everything, taking notes with permission, photographing certain pages of the ledgers. He handled everything with reverent care, like he was touching sacred texts. "These records are remarkable," he said as he worked. Brennan was meticulous. Every transaction documented, every payment tracked. This is primary source material historians dream about. "Professor Chen, I need to know something. If I decide to keep this quiet for a while I figure out what to do, am I breaking any laws?" He looked up from the ledger he was examining. "That depends. If you're asking whether you're required to immediately report historical artifacts found on your property, the answer is no. Not unless they're Native American artifacts or items that clearly belong to someone else. This is more ambiguous. The materials are certainly historical, but they were part of illegal activity. The original owners are dead, and their heirs would have no legal claim to illegally obtained goods." "So it's mine?" "Legally? Probably yes. The safe was hidden on property your family purchased. The person who hid it is deceased. There are no obvious competing claims." He closed the ledger carefully. "But morally, ethically, that's more complex. These items have historical value that transcends ownership. They belong in a museum, in archives, where they can be studied and preserved. And the money?" He smiled slightly. "The money is yours to do with as you wish. Though I'd recommend consulting a lawyer about the tax implications of suddenly discovering a fortune in vintage currency." After Chen left, promising to send me contact information for reputable auction houses and lawyers who specialized in this kind of situation, I sat alone in the vault again. The professor's words echoed in my mind. These items belong in a museum. Maybe he was right. Maybe keeping this hidden was selfish, depriving the world of important historical knowledge. But the world hadn't been there when Robert was dying, when the medical bills piled up higher than our annual income. The world hadn't cared when I had to sell half my herd at a loss just to keep the electricity on. The world sure as hell wasn't going to save my farm from foreclosure. Maybe I was being selfish, but maybe, just this once, I'd earned the right to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mom, Mr. Peterson called again. Says the offer expires Friday. Please at least meet with him. For me?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then I texted back. "I'll meet with him. Thursday, 2 p.m. at the farm. You should be there too." If the DeStefanos wanted this property badly enough to keep raising their offer, I needed to understand why. And if they knew about what was hidden here, I needed to know that too. Because one way or another, this secret had been buried long enough. It was time to see what truth looked like in the daylight. Thursday arrived wrapped in the kind of gray spring weather that made everything look uncertain, the sky neither fully clouded nor clear. I spent the morning cleaning the farmhouse with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with impressing visitors and everything to do with needing my hands busy while my mind raced. Emma had driven in from campus that morning, quiet and tense in the way she got when she was trying to protect me from my own stubbornness. Marcus DiStefano arrived precisely at 2 o'clock in a black Mercedes that looked obscene parked beside my rusted pickup truck. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of casual, expensive clothes that announced money without shouting it. His handshake was firm, professional, his smile practiced, but not unkind. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for agreeing to meet. And you must be Emma. Your mother speaks very highly of you." He had a briefcase, leather and burnished, probably worth more than my monthly grocery budget. We sat in the living room, the afternoon light filtering through curtains my mother had sewn 30 years ago. DiStefano didn't waste time on small talk. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Mitchell. My company has been trying to acquire this property for 18 months. We're prepared to offer $850,000. That's well above market value, and it's our final offer." He slid a folder across the coffee table. "The contracts are ready. You could have a check by the end of next week." Emma's hand found mine, squeezed gently. I could feel her hope radiating like heat. "Why this property?" I asked. "There are bigger farms, better locations for development. Why are you so determined to have mine?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. "Location mostly. It's positioned perfectly for the kind of residential development we have in mind. Close to expanding suburbs, good road access, adequate utilities. Those things are true of half the farms in this county." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're right. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Mitchell. My family has history here. My grandfather did business in this area during the 1930s. He knew the original owners of this land before your husband's family acquired it. There's a sentimental element to this purchase that I'm willing to pay extra for." "Your grandfather was Vincent DiStefano." The smile froze. "You've done your research. Your grandfather worked with Patrick Brennan, the man who used to own this property before he disappeared." The room went very quiet. Emma's hand tightened on mine, confused but sensing the shift in temperature. DiStefano set down the folder he'd been holding and leaned back, reassessing me with new calculation. "That was a long time ago, Mrs. Mitchell. Ancient history. History has a way of staying relevant." I kept my voice steady. "Especially when people keep digging it up." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "My grandfather told me stories before he died. About the business they ran, about Brennan, about what happened when Prohibition ended. He said Brennan had squirreled away a fortune somewhere, insurance against the future. Nobody could ever find it." "And you think it's here?" "I think it's possible, and if it is, it belongs to my family, not yours. Brennan owed my grandfather money when he died, a lot of money. That debt doesn't disappear just because nobody could locate his assets." Emma made a small sound of confusion. I squeezed her hand reassuringly without taking my eyes off DiStefano. "Your grandfather killed Patrick Brennan." I said it flatly, watching his reaction. "That's a serious accusation with no evidence to support it." "Maybe not in court, but we both know it's true. Brennan was settling accounts, preparing to go legitimate or disappear. Your grandfather couldn't let that happen. Too much money at stake, too many loose ends." DiStefano's face had gone very still, professional mask slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, it has nothing to do with the present situation. I'm offering you a fair price for your property. More than fair. That offer stands whether or not there's anything buried here. But if there is something here, you expect me to include it in the sale. I expect you to honor debts that predate your ownership. My grandfather was owed money. If Brennan's cash exists, a portion of it rightfully belongs to my family." I stood up, done with the pretense of polite negotiation. "Your grandfather was a murderer who killed a man to steal his money. That's not a debt, that's theft. And I'm not going to help you complete a crime that started 90 years ago." DiStefano rose as well, his composure cracking. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Mrs. Mitchell. My family has resources, legal and otherwise. If there's something on this property that belongs to us, we will find a way to claim it. Is that a threat? It's a reality. You can take the generous offer and walk away comfortable, or you can fight us and lose everything anyway. Your choice." Emma was on her feet now too, her face pale but determined. "You need to leave, now." DeStefano collected his briefcase, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. At the door, he turned back. "You have until Monday to reconsider. After that, the offer is withdrawn and we pursue other options. Think carefully about what you're protecting here, Mrs. Mitchell. Is it really worth losing everything?" After he left, Emma turned to me with wide, frightened eyes. "Mom, what the hell is going on? What was he talking about?" So I told her everything. The flood, the crack in the foundation, the tunnel, and the vault. The fortune in old whiskey and vintage currency that had been hidden beneath our home for nearly a century. The ledgers documenting her great-great-grandfather's partnership with a bootlegger who'd been murdered before he could retrieve his final cash. She listened in stunned silence, sinking slowly back onto the couch as the weight of it settled over her. When I finished, she just stared at me. "We're rich?" she finally whispered. "Potentially, if I can figure out how to handle this legally, if the DeStefanos don't find a way to claim it, if 100 other complications don't arise." How much money are we talking about? Professor Chen thinks the whiskey collection alone could be worth tens of millions. The cash is harder to estimate, but even if only some of it's convertible to modern currency, it's substantial. Emma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fields that had defined her entire childhood. You could sell everything, the whiskey, the cash, keep the farm and have more money than we'd ever need. It's not that simple. Why not? Some dead bootlegger's money. He's not using it. His family doesn't deserve it, not after what they did. Why shouldn't we have it? Because it's built on crime, on violence and law-breaking. She whirled to face me. "So was this farm, Mom. You just told me great-great-grandpa bought it with bootlegging money. The whole foundation of our family history is built on crime. Does that mean we should give it all up?" I had no answer for that. She was right in a way that made my carefully constructed moral framework feel hollow. "What are you going to do?" Emma asked finally. "I don't know yet, but I need you to trust me to figure it out." She crossed the room and hugged me, fierce and sudden. "I do trust you. I'm just scared. That DeStefano guy, he seemed dangerous." "He is, which is why we need to be very careful about what happens next." That evening, after Emma had driven back to campus making me promise to call if anything happened, Martin came by with pizza and news. He'd been digging through old case files, calling in favors with retired cops who'd known his grandfather. "Vincent DeStefano was never convicted of anything major," he said around a mouthful of pepperoni. "But he was suspected in at least 4 murders between 1932 and 1935. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence went missing, investigations stalled. He had judges and prosecutors in his pocket." And his grandson? Cleaner, legitimate businessman on the surface. But his development company has a history of getting what it wants, one way or another. Properties that wouldn't sell suddenly face zoning problems, tax audits, mysterious fires. Nothing provable, but the pattern is there. I pushed my pizza away, appetite gone. "So if I don't sell, they'll make my life hell until I have no choice." "Possibly, unless you have leverage." "Like what?" Martin pulled out a folder from his jacket. "I found the original investigation file on Brennan's murder, my grandfather's notes. He suspected Vincent DeStefano, had witness statements placing him in the area the night Brennan disappeared. But the witness recanted, and the case went cold." He slid the folder across to me. "This isn't official. It's a copy I made before I returned the file to archives. But it's documentation that the DeStefano family has criminal history related to this specific property." "How does that help me?" "Insurance. If Marcus DeStefano tries to claim that fortune is rightfully his, you have evidence that his family obtained it through murder. That complicates any legal claim he might make." I opened the folder, reading through faded, typewritten reports and handwritten notes. My grandfather's careful documentation of a crime he couldn't prove, but knew in his bones was true. "There's something else," Martin said quietly. "The witness who recanted? His name was Joseph Mitchell, your husband's grandfather." The room tilted slightly. "What?" "He was the one who claimed to have seen Vincent DeStefano leaving Brennan's property the night of the murder. Gave a detailed statement, then recanted 3 days later. Said he'd been mistaken, that it was too dark to see clearly. They threatened him. Or paid him. Or both. The ledgers you found, they show Brennan paid Joseph Mitchell $12,000 for this property. That's a lot of money in 1928, but not nearly what the land was worth. I think Brennan was helping him, maybe protecting him from DeStefano, and when Brennan died, Joseph stayed quiet because he had a family to protect and no proof that would hold up in court. I thought about my grandmother's stories, about how the farm had survived the Depression when others failed, about how they'd always had just enough to keep going. Had that been guilt money? Had the DeStefanos been paying Joseph Mitchell to stay quiet, small amounts over the years that kept him comfortable and compliant? So my whole family history is built on murder and hush money. Your family history is built on survival, Martin corrected firmly. Joseph Mitchell did what he had to do to protect his wife and children in the middle of the Depression. That doesn't make him a bad man. It makes him human. I stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at fields going dark under the spring evening sky. 4 generations of Mitchells had worked this land, raised children here, buried their dead in the family plot on the eastern ridge. All of it built on a foundation of secrets and compromises and choices made under impossible pressure. Maybe that didn't make us special. Maybe every family was built on similar foundations, on the small and large betrayals that survival sometimes required. "I'm going to Professor Chen tomorrow," I said finally. "I'm going to ask him to help me donate the ledgers and a selection of the whiskey to the university for research and historical preservation. The rest I'm going to sell, quietly, through the auction houses he recommended. The money will save the farm and secure Emma's future. And the DeStefanos? Can go to hell. If they try to claim any of it, we'll release your grandfather's investigation file to the media. Let them try to explain why their family has such an interest in a murdered bootlegger's missing fortune." Martin grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Over the next 3 months, I learned more about the intersection of history and commerce than I'd ever imagined existed. Professor Chen became my guide through a world of specialized auction houses and private collectors, of authentication processes and legal documentation. The University of Pittsburgh gratefully accepted the donation of 20 cases of whiskey and all of Brennan's ledgers, establishing a new research collection on Prohibition-era rural crime. The remaining whiskey went to auction in New York, authenticated by experts who confirmed what Professor Chen had suspected. This was one of the most significant collections of pre-Prohibition spirits ever discovered. Bottles sold for prices that seemed absurd, collectors bidding against each other for tastes of history that had survived nearly a century in my basement. The currency was more complicated. Some of it was too old to be legal tender, valuable only to collectors. But enough of it was convertible, and the collector value of the rest was substantial. By the time everything was tallied, authenticated, and sold, the total came to just over $38 million. The number was so enormous it became abstract. It didn't feel real until I paid off the farm's debts, repaired every building that needed work, bought new equipment, rebuilt the herd with quality stock, and still had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. Marcus DeStefano made one more attempt to claim the fortune, filing a lawsuit alleging that his grandfather's estate had a rightful claim to Brennan's assets. The lawsuit died quietly when Martin's investigation file was leaked to a journalist friend, and suddenly the DeStefano family was dealing with uncomfortable questions about their family history. The suit was withdrawn. The development company's interest in my property evaporated, and I never heard from Marcus DeStefano again. Emma graduated that spring with honors, her education secured by money that had waited 90 years to serve its purpose. She took a job in Pittsburgh but came home most weekends, slowly beginning to see the farm not as a burden but as a choice she might one day make on her own terms. On a warm afternoon in late August, I stood in the newly renovated barn watching sunlight stream through windows that had been replaced, finally, after 40 years of making do with cracked glass and duct tape. The dairy herd was healthy and productive. The fields had been planted with a rotation of crops that would rebuild the soil, and the farmhouse had been restored to something approaching what it must have looked like when it was new. But I'd left the vault untouched. The tunnel remained, sealed behind the foundation repair, and the safe stood empty in its hidden room beneath my house. A reminder of what had been hidden there, of the secrets that had kept my family afloat through generations of hardship. Martin had asked me once if I felt guilty, profiting from Brennan's ill-gotten fortune. I'd thought about it for a long time before answering. Guilty? No. Complicated? Yes. I'd tried to explain it to him, how I felt like a steward rather than an owner of this windfall. Brennan hid that money to protect it from people like Vincent DiStefano. He failed to protect himself, but his insurance policy still worked. It protected his land, his legacy, even if it did so through my family instead of his. That's a generous interpretation. Maybe, or maybe it's just the truth. Money doesn't care about moral purity, it just is. What matters is what we do with it. What I did with it was rebuild. Not just the farm's infrastructure, but relationships with the land that had been strained by years of poverty and desperation. I hired local kids to help with the work, paying them well and teaching them skills that might keep them rooted here instead of fleeing to cities like so many of their peers. I bought out 2 neighboring farms that were facing foreclosure, leasing them back to their original families at rates they could afford, keeping the land in production and families in their homes. Some people called it charity. I called it investment in the only community I'd ever known. Professor Chen came to visit in September, bringing a colleague who was writing a book about Prohibition in rural America. We spent an afternoon walking the property, and I showed them the tunnel entrance, now permanently sealed with a glass panel that would let future owners see, but not access the historical space. You could have made this into a tourist attraction, Chen observed. Charged admission to see the Bootlegger's vault. This is my home, not a museum. Some things should stay private. He nodded, understanding. The ledgers are generating extraordinary research. We're discovering patterns in rural organized crime that we never understood before. Your donation has rewritten part of American history. That night, sitting on my front porch watching fireflies rise from the fields like sparks from an invisible fire, I thought about Patrick Brennan, about how he'd built an empire on illegal enterprise, how he'd been meticulous and careful, and ultimately too trusting of the wrong person, how his attempt to secure his future had instead secured mine, 90 years later, in ways he never could have imagined. Emma called as I was heading to bed. Mom, I've been thinking. I want to come home after graduation, not to escape or because I can't find a job, but because I want to learn how to run the farm, really run it, the way you and Dad did. I felt tears I hadn't expected. You're sure? You have so many options now. I know, but this is where I belong. It just took me a while to understand that. She paused. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't work yourself to death, now that you can finally afford to relax. After we hung up, I walked down to the basement one last time that night. I pressed my hand against the sealed glass panel, feeling cool stone beneath my palm. Behind it was the tunnel, the vault, the empty safe that had held a fortune in the dark for nearly a century. Thank you, I whispered to Patrick Brennan's ghost, to my husband's memory, to all the people who'd struggled and compromised and survived on this land before me. Thank you for the insurance, for the legacy, for the chance to choose what comes next. The land stretched dark and fertile beyond my windows, holding secrets I'd never discover, stories that would remain buried. But some secrets had surfaced when they were needed most, and in doing so, had secured a future I'd stopped believing in. The drought of debt and desperation had forced me to drain the foundation of my life, and in that emptiness, I discovered not just treasure, but possibility. The chance to rebuild on honest ground, to transform tainted wealth into clean legacy, to give my daughter the choice I'd nearly lost. The farm would endure, the Mitchell name would continue, and somewhere in the dark beneath my feet, an empty vault stood as silent witness to the truth that sometimes survival requires accepting help from the most unexpected sources, even when that help comes wrapped in 90 years of secrets and the fading scent of illegal whiskey. I turned off the basement light and climbed the stairs to bed, knowing that tomorrow I'd wake to fields that were truly mine, secured not by bootlegger's gold, but by the hard-won understanding that legacy isn't about purity of origin. It's about what you build with what you're given, and how you transform the past into foundation for the future. The flood had revealed what needed revealing. The rest could stay buried where it belonged. The first winter after everything changed came gently, without the brutality I'd learned to expect from Pennsylvania Decembers. Snow fell in measured accumulations, blanketing the fields in white that looked clean instead of oppressive. I stood at the kitchen window on Christmas morning, coffee steaming in my hands, watching Emma and 3 local teenagers she'd hired for winter break repairing fence posts along the eastern pasture. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying across the frozen ground like bells. The farm had a rhythm again, the kind I remembered from childhood visits to my grandmother's place before everything got hard. Not the desperate rhythm of survival, but the steady pulse of work that mattered, work that would still matter tomorrow and next year and 20 years from now. Martin stopped by that afternoon with his daughter Rebecca, who was home from veterinary school. They'd brought pie, as had become tradition since Thanksgiving, and we sat around the table Robert had built from barnwood, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. Rebecca was interested in rural large animal practice, rare enough these days that I'd already offered her a standing job once she graduated. The herd would need a dedicated vet, and keeping young people in the county felt like the best investment I could make. Marcus DiStefano sold his development company, Martin mentioned casually, as Rebecca and Emma disappeared into the barn to check on a pregnant cow. Retired to Florida. His son is running things now, apparently wants to focus on legitimate commercial real estate instead of the strong-arm tactics his grandfather and father favored. Good riddance. Agreed, though I heard something interesting through the law enforcement network. Before he left, Marcus made a substantial anonymous donation to the Historical Society, earmarked specifically for researching and documenting immigrant families during Prohibition. Marion Fletcher thinks it's guilt money. I considered that, watching snow begin to fall again beyond the window. Maybe he finally understood that you can't build a clean future on buried crimes. Sometimes you have to acknowledge what your family did before you can move past it. Martin nodded slowly. Speaking of which, Professor Chen wants to do an oral history interview with you for the university's archive. Says your perspective on discovering the vault and deciding what to do with it is important historical documentation. What would I even say? The truth. That's all history really needs. After they left, I went down to the basement and stood looking at the sealed tunnel entrance. The glass panel showed the first few feet of the passage, brick walls carefully preserved behind the barrier. The university had sent a team to document and photograph everything before I sealed it permanently, creating a digital archive that would outlast the physical space. The vault itself was still there, untouched in the darkness, its empty safe a monument to secrets that had finally served their purpose. I'd thought about filling it in completely, pouring concrete until no trace remained, but Emma had convinced me otherwise. It's part of the farm's history now, she'd argued. Good and bad, it shaped everything that came after. You don't erase that. You acknowledge it and move forward. She was wiser than I'd been at 19, maybe wiser than I'd been at 41. January brought Professor Chen's interview. He set up recording equipment in the living room and asked questions for 3 hours, his gentle probing drawing out stories I hadn't realized I remembered. How Robert had proposed to me in the dairy barn on a morning so cold our breath froze in clouds. How his grandfather had taught him to read the land, to know by the way grass grew or water flowed what the soil needed. How the farm had been struggling even before the cancer, caught between rising costs and falling prices like so many family operations. "And when you found the vault," Chen asked, "what was your first thought?" I'd had months to consider that question, to craft an answer that sounded noble or historically aware. But sitting there with the camera recording, I found myself telling the simple truth. I thought, maybe we can survive this. Maybe there's still a future here. I looked out the window at fields resting under snow, gathering strength for spring. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about not losing everything Robert and his family had built. About giving Emma the choice to stay or go instead of watching the bank auction off her inheritance. And the moral complexity? The fact that the money came from illegal enterprise, possibly from murder? I thought about that a lot. Still think about it sometimes. I chose my words carefully. But I decided that money is just a tool. It doesn't carry moral weight on its own. What matters is how you use it. Brennan's fortune was built on breaking unjust laws during desperate times. I chose to use it to rebuild something sustainable and honest. Maybe that's redemption, or maybe it's just practicality. Either way, it felt right. Chen nodded, satisfied with the complexity of that answer. He was a historian, after all. He understood that real life rarely offered clean moral narratives. In March, the university held a symposium on Prohibition in rural America, centered around Brennan's ledgers and the research they'd enabled. I attended with Emma, sitting in the back of the lecture hall while scholars presented papers on smuggling routes and criminal networks and the economic impact of illegal liquor trade on agricultural communities. They spoke about Patrick Brennan with academic detachment, analyzing his business practices and network connections like he was a case study rather than a man who'd bled to death in the darkness beneath my house. It felt strange, hearing his life reduced to data points and historical significance. But during the Q&A session, an elderly woman in the front row stood up. "I'm Catherine Brennan Walsh," she said, her voice steady despite her age. "Patrick Brennan was my great-uncle. I grew up hearing stories about him, about how he disappeared and left the family with nothing. I just want to thank Mrs. Mitchell and Professor Chen for bringing part of his story back to light, for making him more than just a family legend." After the symposium, Catherine and I spoke for nearly an hour. She was 83, the last surviving person who'd known anyone from Brennan's immediate family. Her grandmother had been Patrick's younger sister, had spent decades wondering what happened to him. "The family always suspected Vincent DiStefano," she told me quietly. "But we had no proof, no body, nothing to pursue. When they found him by the creek months later, the sheriff said he'd probably been dumped there, that he'd been killed somewhere else. My grandmother believed it was Vincent settling accounts before Prohibition ended." I think she was right. Catherine nodded. Finding out he had a contingency plan, that he'd tried to secure something for the future even if it didn't reach his own family, that brings a kind of peace. He wasn't just a criminal who got what was coming to him. He was a man trying to protect what he'd built, even if how he built it was wrong. Before she left, she gave me something. A photograph of Patrick Brennan from 1930, 3 years before he died. He looked younger than I'd imagined, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a slight smile that suggested he knew secrets worth keeping. I had it framed and hung it in the farm office, next to photographs of Robert's grandfather and father. Part of the property's complicated history, acknowledged and remembered. Spring arrived with the violence of rebirth, frost heaving the ground and early shoots pushing through soil that remembered winter. Emma came home for good in April, her engineering degree completed, ready to apply modern knowledge to traditional farming. She had ideas about sustainable practices, about water management and soil health, and integrating technology with land wisdom. Some of it made me nervous, most of it made sense. We hired more help that summer, 6 full-time employees, and a rotating cast of part-timers during harvest. The farm that had nearly broken me with its demands now sustained a dozen families, wages paid reliably every week from accounts that would never run dry in my lifetime or Emma's or her children's. On a humid evening in July, I found myself at the County Historical Society's annual fundraiser, an event I'd always avoided when money was tight. Marion Fletcher cornered me near the dessert table, her eyes bright with schemes. "We're planning to expand the museum," she said without preamble. "Create a whole wing dedicated to Prohibition history in Western Pennsylvania. The university is partnering with us, and we've received several grants. But we'd like to include something from the Brennan collection, if you'd be willing. Not the valuable bottles, just one or two samples that represent what was hidden for so long." I thought about it, about the remaining cases of whiskey still stored in climate-controlled facilities in New York, waiting to be sold to collectors who would never drink them. "I can do better than that. I'll fund the expansion, the whole thing. Anonymous donation, but earmarked specifically for telling the complete story. Not just the romance of rum running, but the violence and exploitation too, the real history." Marion looked like she might cry. "Sarah, that's extraordinarily generous." "It's just money, and history matters, especially history that makes us uncomfortable." August marked 2 years since I discovered the vault. The anniversary passed quietly, marked only by a small ceremony at the university where the Brennan collection was formally dedicated. Catherine Brennan Walsh was there, along with descendants of other families mentioned in the ledgers. Some were proud of their ancestors' entrepreneurial spirit. Others were embarrassed by the criminal connections. All of them were grateful to finally know the truth. Professor Chen pulled me aside after the ceremony. "You know, in all my years studying this period, I've never seen someone handle a discovery like this with such thoughtfulness. You could have kept it all quiet, sold everything privately, told no one. Instead, you chose transparency and education." I had good teachers. I thought about Robert, about his fundamental decency, about his grandfather who'd witnessed a murder and stayed silent to protect his family, carrying that guilt until it killed him. About my own mother, who taught me that owning land meant being responsible to it and through it. And I had enough money that I could afford to do the right thing. That's a privilege most people don't have. That autumn, Emma and I stood in the eastern pasture watching contractors begin work on a small building. Not part of the farm operation, but something separate. A community center where local families could hold events, where kids could learn about agriculture and history, where the past and present could coexist without conflict. "You know what Dad would say about this," Emma observed as the first foundation post went into ground that had been Mitchell land for nearly a century. "That I'm spending money like it grows on trees?" she laughed. "That you're building something that will outlast you. That's what he cared about, not profit margins or efficiency, but legacy." The building was finished by Christmas, a handsome structure of reclaimed barnwood and modern green technology. We held the dedication on a clear, cold day, the whole county seemingly in attendance. Martin gave a speech about community resilience. Marion spoke about the importance of preserving difficult histories. And I said simply that the building was a gift to the place that had given my family everything, including second chances we probably didn't deserve. What I didn't mention was the small room in the basement designed to look like Brennan's vault, with replica ledgers and period bottles and photographs documenting the discovery. A teaching space where school groups could learn about Prohibition not as distant history, but as something that had happened here, beneath their feet, in the soil they walked on daily. Winter came again, my third since Robert's death, my second since discovering that our survival had been secured by a dead bootlegger's insurance policy. I spent a lot of time that season in the farm office, going through old papers and photographs, documenting family history before memory faded further. I found Robert's grandfather's journal, discovered in a box I'd been avoiding because it still smelled like Robert's cologne. The entries were sparse, practical notes about livestock and weather mostly. But near the end, written in an older, shakier hand, was something different. March 1962. Told the boy today about how we got this place. Not the whole truth, couldn't bear that, but enough that he knows the land came at a cost. He asked if we should feel guilty, living on money that wasn't honestly earned. I told him guilt is a luxury farmers can't afford. What matters is what we do with what we're given. We work this land honest and hard. We raise our children to know right from wrong. We pay forward the debt we can never pay back. That's all any of us can do. I sat with that entry for a long time, understanding finally why Robert's father had worked himself into an early grave, why Robert had done the same. They'd been trying to redeem a purchase they hadn't made, to transform tainted origins into clean legacy through sheer force of honest labor. It hadn't worked. You can't outwork history. But you can acknowledge it, learn from it, and choose differently going forward. In February, Marcus DiStefano died in Florida. The obituary mentioned his successful business career, his philanthropy in later years, his survived-by list of children and grandchildren. It didn't mention his grandfather's crimes or his own attempts to claim a murdered man's fortune. History would remember him as a successful developer, if it remembered him at all. I felt nothing reading about his death. No triumph, no relief. Just a mild recognition that certain chapters had closed forever. Spring came early that year, March warm enough that we started fieldwork weeks ahead of schedule. Emma had planned an ambitious rotation, incorporating techniques she'd learned in school with practices Robert's grandfather had documented decades ago. Old wisdom and new knowledge working together. On the first truly warm day, I walked the fence line along the eastern ridge where 6 generations of Mitchells rested in the family plot. Robert's stone was still bright, the marble not yet weathered by wind and rain. Someday it would fade like the others, become part of the landscape it marked. I told him about Emma, about the farm's transformation, about the community center, and the historical preservation, and all the ways his death had somehow led to unexpected life. I told him about the guilt I still carried sometimes, wondering if I should have reported the discovery immediately, should have let authorities decide what happened to Brennan's fortune. But mostly, I just stood there in the spring sunshine, feeling the land breathe beneath my feet, sensing the complicated history of this place in my bones, the secrets it held, and the secrets it had surrendered. The way it remembered everything while judging nothing. The farm would continue. Emma would have children someday, and they'd learn to read the land the way their great-great-great-grandfather had, the way their father had, the way I was still learning to do. They'd know the full story, the good and the complicated, and the parts that resisted easy categorization. And maybe that was enough. Not redemption exactly, but acknowledgement. The understanding that we're all built on foundations we didn't choose, that legacy is something we inherit and transform and pass forward, hoping each generation does slightly better than the last. I walked back to the farmhouse as evening fell, the lights from the community center visible across the fields, the barns solid and restored, the land stretching fertile and full of possibility in every direction. Somewhere beneath it all, an empty vault waited in the darkness, its purpose served, its secrets finally shared. The bootlegger's insurance had paid out 90 years late, but it had paid out completely. And in doing so, it had secured not just survival, but the chance to build something honest and enduring on a foundation of acknowledged complexity. The land forgives nothing, my grandmother used to say, but it forgets nothing either. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, it tells you exactly what it needs. I was finally learning to listen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.